All right, everybody. Welcome. It's Wednesday night. Welcome to another edition of Talking Trout. We've got some great guests on this week, or this month, I should say. We're excited to be talking with Mike Carlson and Charles Carlin from Gathering Waters. We're going to be talking about the advocacy campaign that we're currently involved in to save Knowles Nelson Stewardship. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the program, and you've probably seen the white and the green signs, the public lands or private lands leased for public fishing access, when you're out on the trout streams, and all that public access is made possible through this Knowles Nelson Stewardship Program. So it's vitally important to the work that our TU chapters are doing here in Wisconsin. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I'm going to say, if you've got some questions along the way, please feel free to use the chat box tonight. If you go down to the bottom of your screen, there should be a chat button in the middle. You can click that and a little box will pop up. And so if you got questions for Mike or Charlie along the way as they're going through stuff, by all means, put them in the chat box, and I'll try to come back to it and cover those as we can. We'll probably take a couple of different breaks and let them answer some questions and things like that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mike Carlson from Gathering Waters. So thanks for being with us tonight.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Mike. And really a pleasure to be with you all. Looking forward to the conversation tonight. I think Charlie and I are going to start off with maybe, I don't know, about 15 or 20 minutes of presentation. I'm going to give a little bit of background on the stewardship program, and then Charlie's going to kind of talk about the state of affairs right now with the state budget debate and the advocacy campaign that we've got running, and how we can kind of best work together to get the stewardship program renewed, hopefully for another 10 years. But I think I'll start off quickly by just introducing myself and Gathering Waters here for a minute. I'm, again, Mike Carlson, Executive Director of Gathering Waters. We're Wisconsin's Alliance for Land Trust. So we exist to support and strengthen just over 40 land trust organizations here in the state. And I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with what land trusts are, but in case you're not, when I use that term land trust, or sometimes you might hear land conservancy, basically talking about a independent 501c3 nonprofit organization with a primary mission of protecting land. And so we've got, land trusts pretty much operating in every corner of the state. I know many of them are really great partners with local TU chapters. And our role at Gathering Waters, statewide role, is really kind of threefold. We do public policy advocacy, primarily at the state level and also some at the federal level. And we really stay focused on funding for conservation, so funding for land and water conservation. Secondly, we also provide training and technical assistance for land trusts to really try to ensure that they are as sustainable of organizations as possible. When land trusts protect conservation easements or protect land in fee simple, they're doing that in perpetuity forever. And so we need to make sure that they're sustainable organizations in here for the long haul. And then finally, we really focus on trying to promote the values of land conservation and the work that land trusts do. Again, very similar to the kind of outreach and communications work that Trout Unlimited does for cold water fisheries. And I'll say, just on a personal level, I've been a trout angler for pretty much my entire life. I grew up on the East Coast, trout fishing in the Shenandoah National Park and catching, 8-inch brookies in mountain streams out there. And I've been in Wisconsin since 2002 and have had a lot of opportunity to explore the driftless area and other parts of the state. I'm a Trout Unlimited member, and really just so value the work that Trout Unlimited does here in Wisconsin and across the country. So again, a real pleasure to be with you all here tonight. And why don't I just kind of get right to it with talking a bit about the stewardship program, the Knowles Nelson Stewardship Program. And I want to actually share my screen just for a few minutes here and pull up just a few slides to share. I thought I would just provide a little bit of background on kind of conservation funding here in Wisconsin. And so again, I think tonight we're really talking about the future of land and water protection funding in Wisconsin when we talk about the Knowles Nelson Stewardship Program. So to start with, I guess, what is, when we talk about this statewide program, what is Knowles Nelson? Essentially, Knowles Nelson is a program that provides funding for a number of different organizations and agencies to protect land and water resources here in Wisconsin. The stewardship program has been around for just over 30 years. So it was created in the state budget in 1989. Funding started in 1990, and it's been around since then, providing funding for Wisconsin DNR land purchases and easement purchases. It's a really important source of matching grants for nonprofit conservation organizations like land trusts, groups like Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever. It provides quite a bit of matching grant funding for local units of government to protect things like local parks and trails, and also development dollars to help develop those outdoor recreation infrastructure. And then importantly, it's also historically provided property development dollars, especially to DNR and to those local governments for things like campgrounds, restrooms, trails, boat launches, that sort of thing. Historically, the stewardship program has been the funding for it has been authorized in 10-year chunks of time. So from 1990 to 2000, from 2000 to 2010, and from 2010 to 2020. And why we're talking about this issue tonight, the urgency of it, is that we're looking right in the face of a need to renew the program again. And if we don't renew it in this state budget, funding for it will end in June of 2022. So this is an incredibly urgent time for us to be talking about this issue and about land and water protection in Wisconsin. So that's a brief background on Knowles Nelson, but I wanted to offer a real quick kind of snapshot of even going further back of the kind of history of land protection funding, land and water protection funding here in the state. And I'm sure many of you know this already, but the Knowles Nelson Stewardship Program has a bipartisanship built right into the name, with Governor and Senator Gaylord Nelson, and then Governor Warren Knowles are the namesakes for the program. And again, Governor Nelson as a Democrat, Governor Knowles as a Republican, really both over time embraced funding for and support for outdoor recreation and public lands and protecting our natural resources here in the state. And to go way back, I love this cover of this newspaper article from National Boating Magazine. This is from July of 1962. And it's talking about then Governor Gaylord Nelson, who had proposed what was known back then as the Outdoor Recreation Act program, the ORAP program. And this was a groundbreaking, state funding program in the country, again, for funding infrastructure and public land acquisition for outdoor recreation. Interestingly enough, back in 1962, Governor Nelson proposed funding this program with a penny a pack cigarette tax. If you could imagine that, generating enough revenue to kind of do anything. I can't imagine that, these days, but it's kind of interesting history. That's how conservation funding initially came about here in Wisconsin. So Governor Nelson, with his masterful political acumen, was able to get this program through the state legislature at the time and really laid the groundwork for public land protection and acquisition here in the state. When Governor Nelson then went to the U.S. Senate, and with Governor Knowles in office, then Governor Knowles, who was a longtime angler and outdoorsman, actually expanded the program under his administration. And really that legacy then continued for decades through the 1980s, and then all the way up until 1989, when the stewardship program was created. And again, the stewardship program, with that name, Knowles and Nelson, it really has a strong bipartisan history. It was created, during Tommy Thompson's administration, but with bipartisan support in the legislature. And that's a legacy that I think all of us hopefully really want to stay committed to trying to carry on that bipartisan legacy here in the state. So again, that's just a very brief kind of thumbnail history and overview. and I'll in a minute here turn it over to Charlie, but just wanted to reiterate kind of why we're talking about this issue tonight and what the status of the Knowles Nelson Stewardship Program is right now. As I mentioned, funding for the program is set to expire on June 30 of 2022, which is halfway through the next biennial state budget, if the legislature and the governor can't agree on renewing the program. It's incredible to see that Governor Evers, in his executive budget earlier this year, proposed a 10-year reauthorization of the program at $70 million per year. The program is currently funded at $33 million a year, so this would be a more than doubling of the program funding. But now we get kind of to the hard part, right, where we have to now convince the legislature to continue the program and try to convince them to continue it for another 10 years and to potentially increase funding from the current levels and potentially even hopefully meet the level that the governor has proposed here. But that's really, again, kind of where we're at in the process. It's the state budget really is in the legislature's hands right now. And again, Charlie will kind of talk through the campaign that we're working on collaboratively with Trout Unlimited, and how you all can get involved and help make a difference in making sure we have this program and this funding around for land and water protection into the future. So I think, Charlie, with that, I'll pass it over to you. I could maybe leave this slide up until you wanted to transition to your screen, or I could just pull this down, whatever makes sense.
That's great, Mike. You can pull it down and I'll start sharing the Knowles Nelson website.
Great.
But hey, folks, my name's Charlie Carlin. I work as Director of Strategic Initiatives at Gathering Waters, which often means that I get to do lots of the fun kind of brainstorming, experimental projects. And these days it means I work on the Knowles Nelson Stewardship Campaign all the time. What I'm going to share my screen with you all as well, but this can also be a fun follow along at home. So what you're looking at right now is our campaign website, and you can see it's just knowlesnelson.org. So that's KNOWLES and then Nelson, NELSON.org. Feel free to poke around on here as we're talking as well, and that may bring up sort of questions or food for thought. But I think what I'll do is maybe start from, Mike did such a nice job of setting up kind of the campaign and the urgency in the legislature. So I'll talk a little bit more about that and our campaign, some of the legislative dynamics that we're facing, ways that you all can take action and participate in this campaign. And then we'll kind of take a step back and look at, okay, what's the impact that the stewardship program has had around the state? What's it done for trout fishing, for wildlife habitat, for local parks as well? So what we're looking at here is just the homepage of this our campaign to renew the program. And Mike said that Governor Evers proposed this reauthorization at $70 million per year. And we're facing a tough uphill battle in the legislature in order to really make that happen. As you all know, Wisconsin is a bitterly divided state right now as far as the relationship between the legislative branch and the executive branch, and even really within the Republican Party that controls both houses of the legislature in Wisconsin. There are some pretty deep fissures between what you might think of as sort of the more moderate and the more conservative wings of the party. So kind of the legislative reality that we're facing is we know that we have really strong support among Democratic legislators in both the Assembly and the Senate. We know that we also have strong support from Republican members of the Assembly. Assembly Speaker Robin Vos has been a longtime supporter of the program. Folks like Representative Tony Kurtz from the Sparta area is a longtime champion of the program. Joel Kitchens from Door County, Amy Loudenbeck from the Lake Geneva area. These are all folks who have really gone to bat for land and water conservation across the state of Wisconsin. In the state Senate, we're facing a different dynamic where we have a number of senators who really recognize the value of conservation, both from an economic and from an ethical perspective. We also have some folks who would like to see the program just go away, who don't see a value in public lands, really want to limit what government can do, what government can spend money on, and think that it's time for the program to sunset. So, if there's one thing that you all can do tonight and sort of take away from this, is I'm going to demonstrate just how incredibly easy it is to reach out to your legislators and say, hey, please support the stewardship program. This debate's happening right now. So you see, I got this big orange take action button right here on our homepage. And if I click on that, that'll take you to, you'll see the announcement about EVER's budget release. And then just below here is a contact box. And we've made it super easy to send emails to legislators. So you can see I just punched in my information here. Y'all can come sit on my front stoop now because you have my address and we can drink beers and talk about the stewardship program. And if I click this preview button, it shows me who my representative is. I'm here in Madison, and so Kelda Royce is my state senator. Francesca Hong is my representative. If you want to, you can go in and edit those messages. Otherwise, I just click send, and that's it. You've now sent a thank you note to Governor Evers, and you've sent a note to your assembly rep and your state senator asking them to support the stewardship program. These messages are incredibly valuable. Mike Kerr, Mike Carlson, and I are talking to legislators really almost every day at this point. And it is so helpful when we sit down in a meeting with them for me to be able to go and look at the back end of this and say, hey, Senator, I know last week 25 of your constituents reached out and spoke up on behalf of stewardship. And that makes a difference in those conversations. As jaded and as cynical as many of us, certainly myself included, get about kind of the state of political affairs and how hard it is to move constructive legislation across the finish line, it's still a truth that our representatives and our senators, they listen and they care about what their constituents think. So I really encourage you all just to take that 30 seconds, even if that means you tune out to what I'm saying for a minute, just to get those emails in. So let's just talk a little bit about, okay, what the heck has the stewardship program accomplished for Wisconsin? So where I'm going right now is this research tab on the top here, you'll see. And over 30 years or so, the state has invested about $1.25 billion in land and water conservation. For that, in return, we've protected over 650,000 acres of land in Wisconsin. Those are the acres that we're able to verify. I think DNR actually puts that number closer to 800,000. We also know that those investments are spread out pretty evenly all across the state of Wisconsin. So more than 9 out of 10 Wisconsin households are within a mile of a Knowles Nelson investment. And that's because Knowles Nelson invests in a huge breadth of outdoor amenities. So for trout fishers, we're talking about more than 300 stream bank easement grants that are protecting something like 3,500 acres right alongside streams that are providing public access for fishing. Mike Kerr and I were talking at the beginning of the call, and we think that's more than 300 miles of stream that have been protected and given public access through Knowles Nelson investments. Those Knowles Nelson dollars are often seed money as well that really unlocks other dollars also. So many of you may have heard, for example, of the Land and Water Conservation Fund at the federal level. And this is money that's set aside from revenues from offshore oil and gas drilling and that's designated for conservation projects. Usually the money requires a local match. So the state or the local community has to put in some money, and then the federal government comes in and matches that money. There are also pots of money that come through folks like the US Department of Agriculture as well. So what we have in Wisconsin is such a gem with the stewardship program. I was just reading last night about the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and there are a group of 8 Western states whose economies are hugely reliant on outdoor recreation, have written to the federal government asking for a waiver on that match requirement for Land and Water Conservation Fund dollars, because they don't have this kind of state program that we do in Wisconsin. So these are states like Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Utah, places that we really equate with being absolute gems of outdoor recreation, that they don't have this kind of foundational funding to be able to unlock those federal dollars. So this is a real gift that we have. What do we get from that, right? So we know that outdoor recreation is a huge economic driver in Wisconsin. Generates something like $18 billion a year in consumer spending. We're talking about well over 100,000 jobs that are supported by the industry. The stewardship program also really supports the forest products industry. So, and it does that through purchase of working forest easements up north, and then sometimes the outright, what we call fee purchases, buying the land outright as well. Counties in Wisconsin do that through the county forest program of the stewardship program. And what that allows them to do is maintain large intact parcels of working forest that counties can then harvest, use those revenues to support local government, provide services to people in rural areas. But then that also really keeps intact our trail systems, mountain biking trails, hiking trails, ATV and snowmobile trails as well. And then you might ask, okay, where the heck does that 9 out of 10 Wisconsin households number come from? How can that be? And that's because there's a local government portion of the program, and that pays for bike trails, your neighborhood park, those restrooms and campground facilities that Mike was talking about. So if any of y'all are interested and you're curious about, okay, like where's that stewardship investment that's close to my house or that's close to my community, punch in just map.knowlesnelson.org, and it'll take you right here to this interactive map. And so we can see that we at Gathering Waters, we've been able to account for about $800 million of the Knowles Nelson spending. That's because we haven't been able to shake loose from the DNR their data on where they've spent money on development projects. So that's like improvements to DNR lands. But all the community projects, all the DNR acquisitions are in here. And so if I go and I select, my parents are from Langlade County. And so if I go up to Langlade County, the map will zoom in, and I can see that there have been more than 70 projects up there, bringing about $10 million in state investment. And any one of these projects, you can go in and just click on this pin. And so, for example, this project here was Summit Lake Park Development. This is a place I take my kids swimming here every summer. And we know that back in 2001, the state kicked in about $16,000. And what that project was to rehab a public swimming beach there and to put in some restroom facilities. You can also click on this little arrow here at the bottom, and it'll bring up all the details of grants in whatever area you choose. And so you can sort this map out by the county where you live or the Senate district or assembly district that you're in as well. I'm going to share just one last thing and then recognize that we've been talking for a while, and so we'll stop talking and open this up for discussion. But if we go back over here to the website, you can see we've got this headline here that says, when we protect nature, nature works for us. And we're saying that there's a $2 billion value returned to Wisconsin every year from stewardship investments. So how did we come to that number? And you remember, over about 30 years, we've put just a little over $1 billion in. And what we're saying is we get double that back every single year. So we worked with researchers from UW-Madison this last summer to do what academics call an ecosystem services analysis. And that's just a fancy way of saying, what's the work that nature does for us every single day, as long as we protect its basic integrity? And that's things like air and water filtration, flood mitigation, carbon sequestration. Some of that is aesthetics. We all know that we enjoy having a good view, that property values are higher near conserved lands, access to recreation, protecting biodiversity. And academics have studied the heck out of this and worked really hard to quantify those numbers, to say what's the value of that water filtration, sequestering carbon, knowing that if we protect a wetland upstream of our community, that next time there's a major rain event, it's going to protect us by buffering those floodwaters. And so we were able to say that basically every single acre protected by stewardship dollars returns about $3,000 in these services every single year. And that's where that $2 billion value comes from. So if you put that in the context of other major infrastructure investments that the state makes, take roads, for example. We invest about that much money, about $1 billion every single year in the state trunk highway system, or a major interchange project like the zoo interchange in Milwaukee was recently reconstructed. That costs about $1 billion. So we like to think we have a great story to tell just from the incredible value that stewardship provides, specifically for access and habitat for anglers, but then really for all of Wisconsin residents, because whether or not you actually get out and enjoy these lands, they're working for you every single day. So why don't we come up for air there and take a breath and see if there are any questions that we can field or thoughts out there.
Thanks, Charlie. And thanks, Mike, too. This is a great primer on Knowles Nelson and why it's so important. There was one question in the chat box from Kirk. He asked, how do we know if our legislators are for or against stewardship? And if they're against, like what their arguments are. And I will maybe take it a step further and say, okay, if you find out that your legislator is maybe not a fan of the program, like, what's your next steps? Or do you have any advice on how to continue to have a conversation with them, even though they may be fundamentally opposed to your position on the program?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I had a couple of thoughts just initially, just to respond to that. I think just context wise for everyone, that we found, and it's actually immensely helpful for Mike and Charlie and I to get emails forwarded from, like, constituent emails that folks get back from their legislators. So if you email your legislators, I don't know, 9 times out of 10, we found that the legislators are pretty responsive in sending. I mean, it might be a form email, but you'll get something back, and usually it describes generally what their position is on the issue. And again, it's helpful for us. Sometimes we don't know with every single legislator what their arguments might be, and it's helpful for us to see that. So again, that's another added benefit of going to that take action button and sending those messages. The other thing, I guess, just to be aware of for folks is that I know it can be a little frustrating that for the stewardship program, we typically don't have a voting record for every single legislator, because the issue usually comes up in the state budget. And so typically the really powerful Joint Committee on Finance are the ones that sort of vote on, like, specific programs. So for Joint Finance members, we could give you a little bit more detail on how they voted in the past, but for an average legislator, they're typically voting up or down on the entire state budget bill at the very end. And so we, again, don't typically have a voting record for legislators on stewardship. But Mike, to your point about, responding to legislators, I mean, I think we found over time that trying to maintain a level of dialogue and not being sort of overtly combative, I guess, if possible, with them is helpful. And that, I think all of us really we're playing the long game here, right? And we're I think we're trying to develop relationships over time. We're trying to, demonstrate a really compelling case on the ground in local districts. And I think, obviously emails and phone calls are part of it, but I think thinking about it, over time, are there opportunities to bring some of these folks out to actually do a site visit? I know we collaborated with Mike and Trout Unlimited volunteers at the end of 2020 on several site visits with Senator Markline, Senator Roth, and others. Got them out stream side and talked to them about specific projects and with local constituents there. And it's not going to like change their minds overnight, but I think over time that kind of relationship building can definitely pay dividends. So,
and I think, just another piece of that question was, okay, so folks who are opposed to the program, why? What is it that they have to say? How do we respond to that? Yeah, and I think I'll offer a couple of points. One thing we like to remind legislators of is how wildly popular land and water conservation is, whatever individual misgivings a legislator might have. So Gathering Waters, along with the Nature Conservancy and Trust for Public Land, we regularly poll Wisconsin voters on attitudes towards conservation. And we found this year that even in the midst of the pandemic, and even putting the questions in the context of economic anxiety about what's going to be the economic impact of COVID, because there was a lot of fear about that something like 93% of Wisconsin voters support the idea of the state continuing to invest in land and water conservation. And even among voters who identify as conservative, we've got numbers that are well above 2/3. And that's sort of regardless of party, regardless of geography. Some of the things that legislators will say is, well, this program is just a land grab. It's just about buying up a whole bunch of land up north that nobody else was going to purchase anyways, and that isn't really developable. And that's, I think, a common myth about the program. And so one of the ways that we respond to that is showing them the map of Knowles Nelson investments around the state, reminding them that nearly everyone lives within a mile or so of a Knowles Nelson investment, that yes, there have been really important forest acquisitions, but that there is so much riparian work, community work that has happened as well. I think a second thing that legislators will ask is, well, how much land is too much? When do we know that we've purchased enough? In Wisconsin, we have about 16-17% of the state in some sort of conservation. That's lagging well behind Minnesota and Michigan, both of which are kind of upwards of about a quarter of their land area is in some sort of conservation. And then again, we remind legislators that, look, the people of Wisconsin don't think that we're done. And that's why there's such enthusiastic support for the work that the stewardship program does. Across the country, not just here in Wisconsin, people really care deeply about clean air and clean water and access to outdoor recreation. And it's simply not a partisan issue. It's something that we all care about as people who live together in community. And then I think the third sort of really frequent concern that we hear about the program is the fact that it's financed with bonding. So, and that means borrowing. And so this is how most governments, and certainly Wisconsin, finance long-term investments, is through the issuance of bonds. And so these are 20-year bonds that the state issues in order to provide funds for Knowles Nelson. So that means that if $33 million in bonds are issued this year, those get paid back over the course of about 20 years. It's the same thing we do when we make buildings, when we build roads. If you want to bring it down to the household level, it's why many of us have a mortgage on our house, right? It's something that's going to benefit us for decades, but that there's no way we could afford the whole cost of it right up front. And so sometimes we'll hear legislators say, well, we can't just keep running up the state's credit card. And that's not quite accurate. You know, we have borrowed about $1.25 billion, or maybe $1.3 billion, I think is what it is, for the stewardship program. We've made payments of about $1.2 billion. And that leaves us with about $500 million in outstanding principal. And then we remind legislators of that value that we get back every single year. And you know, that $2 billion returned to us every single year. For those of you, I saw some comments in the chat about the Joint Finance Committee listening sessions and reaching out to legislators. I'm just going to share my screen again real quick so you all can see. But we've put together a really nice, quick and dirty, one-page talking points that can be great for those of you who are interested in attending a listening session or giving your legislator a call. So if we go to this Take Action page on the Knowles Nelson website, and then there's Advocacy Tools. And in the Advocacy Tools, the very first one is Knowles Nelson Talking Points. And if you click that download button, that gives you a one-pager with 7 or 8 just kind of key bullet points for the program. And those can be really nice to use when you're chatting with legislators or reaching out to them. But I will say that really the most effective way to communicate with legislators is through personal stories and personal impact. You know, so talk about, why does getting out on the land matter to you and your family? Why is clean air and water important? What's a stewardship property that really means a lot to you? And it's those personal stories that are going to stick with legislators more than any numbers, you know, that Mike and I can put in front of them.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. That's great. Those are all great points. I'll just add one more to that. We like to talk about economics, and the big buzzword lately has been rural prosperity. And I mean, outdoor recreation is I think a key to that in the future, is rural prosperity and creating opportunities, economic opportunities for folks, whether you live in a city or in a more rural area. And I think public lands provide that opportunity. And we all know many of us are hunters and anglers, and hunting and fishing is like a $4 billion a year, you know, industry in the state of Wisconsin. So those are numbers when you start tossing out there, like that'll catch a legislator's ear. Somebody else had a question about one of the common things that they will hear is that, and I think Mike, you actually answered it in the chat box, but I'll just ask it again. It says, one common argument that I've heard is that acquired land is removed from tax rolls, potentially hurting funding for local governments. Mike, do you want to just touch on that?
Yeah, so it depends on, again, stewardship has a number of different sub-programs that provide funding to different entities, but if DNR is acquiring land in fee simple, you know, outright purchase of land, they do have aids in lieu of property taxes that are paid on that. It's a kind of a complicated formula, and I wouldn't be able to say, like, you know, across the board that it sort of makes local communities completely whole, but it's not as if that revenue is, you know, completely eliminated from the equation. I mean, I also think this is where I get sort of, I've been around this game long enough to get sort of annoyed by that argument by legislators, because the notion that, you know, public land acquisition is what's actually driving the challenges to local government budgets is like so absurd in the whole scheme of things, when there are so many other, whether it's revenue caps that the legislature themselves put in place, whether it's use value assessment on agricultural land. I mean, and again, those are all policy choices we've made as a state. But the notion that public lands are what are undermining local government budgets is just not, you know, it's just not accurate. But yeah, we certainly hear that from legislators sometimes. So,
yeah. Are you guys? So I've struggled with this from a leadership standpoint in Trout Unlimited as an organization, knowing that like a lot of people are getting vaccinated with the COVID vaccine, and we have these joint finance committee public hearings coming up, and they're like, I believe 3 of them are in person and 1 is, and then there's going to be a virtual meeting at the end. Are you recommending to your members that they personally go out and attend one of these if they feel comfortable doing so, or do you think there's a I mean, I know when you go to one of these, you sit and you wait for a couple hours and you get 2 minutes to speak, and the legislators don't respond. They're just taking notes. So is there a better use of your time, or do you think there's value in sending our members out to these?
Yeah, I mean, I personally have struggled with this very question for sure, just like you have, Mike. I think from our perspective, we feel like it's our sort of job to inform our members about these, but we're not sort of building them up as sort of a end all be all kind of opportunity to engage with, the Joint Finance Committee or legislators. I think we're really putting more of an emphasis on, having local constituents contact their elected officials and really sort of trying to make those connections in local districts. I think that's the number one most important thing we can be doing. It's going to be important that stewardship comes up at those public hearings. I think, I feel like we're probably going to have reasonably good coverage if folks, are near one of those hearing sites and feel comfortable doing it. I think it would be great and helpful, but I totally think it has to be sort of individuals' judgments. And I guess the takeaway message is there's lots of ways that folks can get involved and can, contact legislators and lawmakers about this issue. It doesn't have to be in person at one of these events. So.
Yeah, and I'll say within the TU sphere, so we've been working with Taylor Ritterbush, who's our Great Lakes advocacy coordinator. Him and I have been kind of trying to line up some in-district legislative meetings where we could get some folks out to local projects to kind of, like you said, like we did a couple of them late last fall with Senator Mark Line and Senator Roth, and it's something that I think we'd like to get as people are more comfortable doing things outside and getting together again. I just think there's so much more value in having those smaller groups like out stream side and having a conversation with your assembly person or your senator. You get so much more out of that rather than going to like a listening session and spending 2 hours in a crowded room and waiting for your turn to give your 2 minutes to speak. So there are certainly different ways to go about, taking action and participating as an advocate. So, I know somebody mentioned in the chat box something about Minnesota's got kind of an interesting way to fund conservation. And they're wondering if, I think it's I forget what it's called. It's the Lassard. I can't think of the name of it right now. It escapes me, but it's basically a minuscule percentage of like a sales tax that they put on there. And that funding goes towards conservation and cultural arts, projects. So is there anything, have any legislators like kicked around that idea in Wisconsin as a way to fund conservation here that you're aware of?
Yeah, I'll answer that question in a second, Mike. I think it sounds like Kirk was specifically talking about a program where folks can donate to conservation to fund projects. And I think there's at least a couple of programs in Wisconsin that do that. And certainly you can, when you're filing your state taxes, there's a checkoff box for conservation. And then when you buy your licenses, there's also that, what is it, the Outdoor Heritage Fund? I forget what it's, Cherish Fund.
Cherish.
Yeah.
Cherish.
I think in the sort of voluntary donation programs, I've just never heard of those generating kind of the level of revenue that we're talking about for something like stewardship. The Minnesota case, and there's a couple of other examples around the country. I'm glad you brought that up, Mike, because it certainly comes up a lot in conversations about this topic. So bear with me here. I'll try to explain this in a really as simply and briefly as possible, because it's actually really interesting. So, each state in the United States has a different approach to how laws can be made and put on the books. And so there are some states like California and Florida where there are ballot initiatives where voters can actually directly put questions on the ballot. And in some of those states with ballot initiatives where you don't have to go through the legislature first, you can put them directly on the ballot. In some of those states, we've seen some remarkable investments in conservation. In Florida, back in, 2014, I think it was, the same year that Rick Scott was reelected governor of Florida, Florida voters approved $9 billion in funding for conservation. If that doesn't tell you something about how bipartisan this issue is, it's just remarkable. But again, they had that mechanism where they could put it straight on the ballot. In Minnesota, they have a system where, in this case, they amended the state constitution. In Minnesota, it could go through one session of the legislature, be approved by the legislature, and then go to the voters for a referendum, as it's called, a referendum. And yes, in 2008, the legislature passed a increase to the sales tax, changed their constitution that then was put forward as a referendum to voters. It's an interesting fact that there has not been a single instance since 2008 in any state of a state that does not have a ballot initiative process where voters can go straight to the ballot. There's not been a single instance of where a legislature has approved an increase in taxes or a significant, like major increase in fees, but an increase in taxes to fund conservation. It just hasn't happened. And that's largely to do with the political dynamics in our country, I think, right now. But it was an amazing alignment of the stars and of sort of political fate in Minnesota in 2008 to allow that to happen. Would we love to have that happen here in Wisconsin? Absolutely. It's going to be I don't know. I don't see a path to victory on that anytime soon here. And in Wisconsin, we have to go through 2 legislative sessions, and then it goes to the voters in order to amend our constitution. So it takes an even longer period of time to do that. So. Just looking at a couple other questions here. To address those who are concerned about funding for local governments to make clear to local people of the area, because we love the public lands, contribute to the local economy. Yeah, I think that local economic argument is so important. And I mean, Trout Unlimited has been just a leader on helping to quantify that, right? I mean, Mike, you know the facts and figures better off the top of your head than I do, but your TU's driftless area economic study, I mean, it was just phenomenal, the economic impact on largely rural communities in that region, but not only in Wisconsin, but in neighboring states.
Yeah, it's over. I mean, the first time we did it was over 10 years ago. We did the first study for the driftless, and they found the total economic impact was 1.2 billion. And then this most recent one, the study that we did in 2016, I want to say 2016, 2017, it was 1.6 billion in annual economic impact in the driftless area. So that's spread out over like those 4 states, but that whole region is smaller than Wisconsin itself. So I think you could make a strong argument that, there's, like when you say that, what is this investment in public land giving back to us every year? Just having those miles of access to public trout streams are generating economic activity year after year after year. So, and with a lot of legislators, especially the ones in those rural areas, like that makes a huge impact. Like they understand how important it is to the small businesses in their areas, the restaurants and things like that, that folks are coming out there and they're recreating there, and they're coming with their families and their friends, and they're bringing the money and they're spending the money in the local stores and restaurants and shops and motels and campgrounds and all of that. So it's a win-win for everybody, and I think we just want to make sure that we see it continuing. So
But Mike, one other topic that we touched on, but we didn't really sort of explain the rationale for it, which I think is actually, it's important for a lot of different partners who interface with the stewardship program, but particularly I think for trout stream access is why are we pushing for a 10-year reauthorization? Why not 2 years or 5 years, or I mean, why 10? And part of it obviously is the sort of historic legacy of the program has been reauthorized for a decade at a time in the past, except for in the last budget when it was only extended for 2 years. But in 1990, it was for 10 years, 2000 for 10 years, 2010 for 10 years. But really, I mean, the practical argument is that, when you're doing real estate deals and you're working with private landowners, it just takes a long time to piece together projects, to finance projects, to do fundraising, to build those relationships. And I mean, I think about, I spend a lot of time in the driftless area. I mean, I just think about the land ownership patterns. You look at a plat map in the Willow Creek or the Blue River watershed. I mean, that you look at a plat map and it's just such a fragmented ownership pattern. And for someone like, Jeff Hastings or Duke Welter, or, or volunteers you guys have on the ground out there, to be, again, working with those farmers and those private landowners, like that is not something that happens overnight or in 12 months or in 24 months even. So, I mean, I think that long-term reauthorization, we need robust funding, but I think for all the partners that actually know kind of how this program really happens on the ground, that long-term renewal is pretty critical. And again, I think for the success of the stream bank easement program, that's especially true.
Yeah, it's hard to, I mean, we usually plan projects, 2 or 3 years out, and it's hard to know if you don't know if the program is going to even be available to give you, to be able to go onto that farmer's land and try to make the purchase of the easement rights. It's really hard to plan a project or start finding funding for that project. So yeah, the long term is a big portion of it. So could you guys talk briefly about Team Knowles Nelson and who some of the players are? I mean, I don't need you to go through and tick down every organization on there, but it's a pretty broad swath of groups that have come together and are supporting this program, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike. So Team Knowles Nelson is, we call our coalition Team Knowles Nelson, and I'll share my screen here. This is just on the about page of the knowlesnelson.org website. But we, so Team Knowles Nelson is thousands of individuals across Wisconsin who have contributed to the cause, spoken up with their legislators, written postcards, made phone calls, but then also, really represents a pretty remarkably broad cross section of organizations around the state. So you have, sort of the usual suspects. We're Gathering Waters, we're the Alliance for Land Trusts, and so most our land trust members are all members of Team Knowles Nelson. But then the sporting organizations, Trout Unlimited, Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, Rough Grouse Society. But then you also have some folks that you might not necessarily think of, folks like the Realtors Association, the Counties Association, the Towns Association. And that is because I think those organizations really recognize the quality of life piece that comes with investments, especially in local parks, trails, waterways, that the stewardship program has made possible. And that really helps, brings a lot of legitimacy to our argument, that this is a really bipartisan issue that goes all across the state and kind of across the political spectrum as well. We were in a meeting a couple of weeks ago with Senator Julian Bradley. He's from the Franklin area in southeastern Wisconsin, and a freshman senator who is, certainly very much a fiscal conservative, but we were joined by the owners of Wheel and Sprocket on that visit. And Wheel and Sprocket is a bike chain or bicycle store chain here in Wisconsin. They've got about 10 stores, and they have a store in Franklin and a trail system that goes right out their back door that was funded by stewardship dollars. And they spoke about how, they can't sell bikes if people don't have a place to go ride them. And we hear outdoor retailers say the same thing about trout fishing and about pheasant hunting, that they have the business that they have because there are places to get out and enjoy in Wisconsin. So like I said, this is on that about page of knowlesnelson.org. You're welcome to go in and check out all of those different organizations on there.
Great, thanks. Appreciate that. Corey White had a question here. What is the status of willing seller authorization? You guys familiar with that?
Yeah, I was having trouble putting that into context. I don't know if Corey, if you want to, you can come off mute maybe and just describe that a bit more.
I'm not sure if you're trying to get at like how we find fair market value, or are you on, Corey?
Yeah, how easy is it just to go in and buy land from folks for these projects? If I remember correctly, there historically have been like layers of bureaucracy you have to feed the land purchasing agreements through.
Yeah, I don't know, Mike, I don't know if you've got thoughts on that with regard to like trout stream easements or.
I do know it takes a while, and I know it can be frustrating from a landowner's point of view. I mean, even something simple like selling an easement. Like I'll give you, for example, in the budget a couple of years ago, they put a priority on the stream bank protection program and wanted to see an increase in dollars for conservation easements in the DNR portion of stewardship spending. And halfway through that, so the DNR got all the pieces together to like ramp up this program, and halfway through, the legislature decided that they wanted to force the department to sell off or offer for sale 10,000 acres of land, right? And like I think the DNR has one person on staff who actually does the appraisals for all these properties. And so they just basically like put the entire, stream bank protection program on hold for 10 months while they could evaluate all these other properties that, they're required by statute to offer for sale. And I can see from a landowner's point of view where that would be extremely frustrating. But at the same time, I think, if you can reach out to your local, if it's fishing land, your local fisheries biologist would probably be the first contact if you wanted to sell an easement. If you have property and you want to, leave a legacy to future generations, and you're thinking about putting that into, public hunting and fishing lands, I still think either the local fisheries biologist or the local wildlife biologist would be your first contact, and then they ought to be able to direct you on how to navigate through the system. But as far as there being like a quick switch to flip, I'm not sure that exists. I guess I'm just not that familiar with the program from the operational side of things to be able to answer that. Everybody, I know we're approaching the 9 o'clock hour, and I'll put it out there. If anybody else has questions, fire away in the chat box quick. I do want to thank you, Mike and Charlie, for spending some time tonight, and you're extremely knowledgeable about the program, and I'm learning more about it as we, every day it seems like I learned something new, and it was great to hear some of the history and see some of those old pictures and that you had from like where the idea kind of came from and where it all started from. So that's pretty neat to see, and just want to thank you guys for you've been the champion of all the organizations, like you've kind of been the leaders of the groups. And I just want to say thank you for stepping up and doing that, because somebody needed to do it to make this happen. And I don't want to speak too soon. I know we've got a ton of work to do to get this over the finish line, but you and the work that your organization has done has set all of us up to be in a position to make that finishing stretch. So thank you for your efforts.
Could I ask Mike and Charles a question?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, David.
I've been involved with the Landmark Conservancy possible purchasing XL Energy property for many years. And I know that Rick Remington and Lindsay Kitchell have talked to you folks at Gathering Waters. Is there anything new about that and possibly getting it before Joint Finance Committee for review?
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you, David, for that question. And maybe just to generalize that question a little bit, I think one issue for folks to just be aware of is that when you have a program that's been around for 30 years, I think one challenge we have is that there's political baggage that has sort of accumulated with the program over time. And one of those pieces of political baggage is that for now more than a decade, the legislature has given itself authority, or given the powerful Joint Committee on Finance authority to basically have what they call passive review, or sort of oversight of projects that are over a certain dollar amount. And, we've had gone for years without that really being a problem, and not many projects were getting objected to by, at the last minute by Joint Finance through this review process. But unfortunately, especially with divided government right now, we've seen a little bit more sort of political games being played, and certain members of Joint Finance coming in and using that oversight authority to object to projects. And there's a absolutely just fantastic project. I think that Excel project is right near the Chippewa, Tiffany Bottoms, Lower Chip area, and blocks in some incredible, existing public lands. I mean, it's just, it seems like it would be a no-brainer, but for whatever reason, it sort of caught the scrutiny of a couple of members of Joint Finance, and they objected to it. And that's their prerogative to do that. And unfortunately, we have continually been trying to urge them to try to, urge Joint Finance members to find some, middle ground to move that project forward. If they have specific concerns that they could share with the, Landmark and the local partners, that maybe the partners could somehow restructure that project to alleviate some of those concerns. But unfortunately, at this time, we, I don't have anything specific that I can share that, about any progress on that particular project. And again, it's really unfortunate that we see these sort of political games being played with, public lands and on issues that, seem like they should be above that kind of political fray. But that's just sort of the reality that we're operating in right now. So I appreciate you bringing that up, David. And again, I think it's important for everyone to just be aware of that, and again, as you're talking to your legislators, it's like, organizations, partners like TU, like Land Trust, like the DNR that are doing these projects, like we're putting a ton of time and energy and volunteer time, staff time into getting these projects done. And we're doing, the best we can to do high quality, really focusing on the best of the best. And I think the more legislators can understand that, hopefully we can kind of reduce the risk of some of these objections in the future. So
our local Republican legislators both supported the acquisition, but all local people figured it was Senator Tom Tiffany that was opposed to it. And even though his cousin is also a Tiffany, and it was the Tiffany Wildlife Area is named after his grandfather, it didn't make any difference.
Yeah, I think Senator Strobel is probably another one he's from Southeast Wisconsin, who is probably also was standing in the way of that project, unfortunately. But I think that's sort of the challenge we have, right? It's sort of, we could try to, get really sort of aggressive and try to go after some of these legislators publicly, but maybe in the short run that would make a difference. But I think, just given the approach, kind of the political approach that groups like Gathering Waters and I think Trout Unlimited and others have taken over time, is that we really want to focus on that long game. We want to keep this overall program in place. And I think we just want to try to stay focused on building those relationships with local constituents and with legislators as much as possible. And, there's obviously, there are going to be times where we have to be confrontational, but I think our goal is, again, to try to keep our eye on the ball and stay focused on that long game. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just wanted to mention, I think you all probably on this call know this, but that Charlie and I, when we first jumped on with Mike, were applauding him for being like the super volunteer. We're like in awe of all the places that Mike Kerr can be at any given time. And he is incredibly engaged and active in this campaign. And kudos to you, Mike, for your leadership. And we really value the partnership with Trout Unlimited. So.
Yeah, this one hits home, and I'm 44 years old, so stewardship's been working the majority of like all of my adult life since I was a teenager. Stewardship's been working, and I've been reaping the benefits of it, and now my kids are reaping the benefits of it, and I guess we just want to make sure to see that through and make sure that future generations get to enjoy these places, because it really does make Wisconsin truly something special. So with that, I guess before we go, I wanted to let folks know, if you're interested in advocacy, and if you want to get more involved, by all means, if you think that there's a good project that you have that would make a good showcase piece, that you want to try to get a legislator out and walk the stream and talk to them a little bit about what you've done locally, please reach out to myself or Taylor Ritterbush, and we'll pull in some of our partners like Mike and Charlie here, maybe some folks from Ducks Unlimited or whoever the other partners, that seem to make sense for something like that. And we'd love to do a stream walk this summer with you locally and with your legislators. So be thinking about that as this advocacy campaign moves forward. So thanks again for taking the time tonight. Really appreciate it, guys.
Yeah, and if there are any questions that we weren't able to get to, don't hesitate to reach out. Our website's gatheringwaters.org, and our contact info is on there. And obviously, Mike has a lot of knowledge about this program too. But yeah, don't hesitate to reach out with any other questions.
Sounds great. Thanks again for spending.
Appreciate it.
Thanks again for spending some time with us, everybody. We're gonna leave it there, and let's go convince some legislators to 10 years, 70 million. That sounds good, right?
Good, Mike. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mike. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.